Thunder rolled across the Nebraska plains as Sarah Grayson huddled beneath her wagon, her thin blanket doing little to shield her from the relentless spring downpour of 1875. The decision to leave Philadelphia had seemed so clear 3 months ago, but now, with her supplies dwindling and her spirit nearly broken, she questioned everything. "Hold on just a little longer," she whispered to herself, pulling her knees tighter to her chest as another gust of wind drove the rain sideways, soaking her skirts despite the minimal protection the wagon offered. Her chestnut mare nickered nervously from where she stood tethered nearby, equally miserable in the storm. Sarah had been traveling for weeks, following the promise of land and a new beginning after her father's passing had left her with nothing but debts and painful memories. At 22, she had sold what little remained of their belongings and purchased this wagon, determined to claim the small plot of land her father had acquired years ago near Nebraska City. The rain showed no signs of letting up as darkness fell completely. Sarah shivered, her teeth chattering as she tried to light her small lantern with trembling hands. The matches were damp, and after 3 failed attempts she gave up, resigned to spending the night in cold, wet darkness. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over the storm until a deep voice called out, startling her so badly she knocked her head against the wagon's undercarriage. "Hello there. Anybody alive under that wagon?" Sarah froze, one hand instinctively reaching for her father's old revolver tucked beneath her sodden skirts. Out here, alone on the trail, a woman couldn't be too careful. "I'm armed," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady despite her chattering teeth. "State your business." A tall figure dismounted from a horse, approaching slowly with hands raised in a gesture of peace. In the dim light, Sarah could make out the silhouette of a man in a wide-brimmed hat, water streaming off it like a small waterfall. "Name's Frank Keller, madam. Most folks call me Frank. I was heading back to my place when I spotted your wagon. No one should be out in this weather without proper shelter." He kept a respectful distance, seemingly aware of her wariness. Sarah squinted through the darkness, trying to gauge whether this stranger posed a threat. "I'm fine, Mr. Keller. Just waiting out the storm." Frank took a step closer, and a flash of lightning illuminated his features, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, keen eyes, and a concerned expression that seemed genuine. "With all due respect, madam, you're liable to catch your death out here. That rain's coming down harder by the minute." He glanced up at the sky, then back at her. "My ranch is about 2 miles east, but I reckon you don't want to abandon your wagon. Would you permit me to improve your situation a bit?" Sarah hesitated. Every lesson of caution she'd learned warned against trusting strangers, especially men encountered alone on the trail. But the cold had seeped into her bones, and the prospect of spending the entire night in such conditions was becoming increasingly unbearable. "What do you propose?" she asked, still keeping her hand near her revolver. "I've got some tools and a tarp in my saddlebags. Could rig up a shelter that'll keep you dry at least. Won't take more than half an hour." Frank remained where he was, waiting patiently for her decision, rain dripping from his coat. After a long moment, Sarah nodded. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Keller." "Be right back then," he said, returning to his horse. Sarah watched as he rummaged through his saddlebags, extracting a folded canvas tarp, rope, and what looked like a small hatchet. He worked efficiently, first using the hatchet to cut several branches from nearby trees, then fashioning them into supports that he secured to her wagon wheels. Within 20 minutes, he had constructed a slanted roof that extended from the side of her wagon to the ground, creating a triangular shelter that kept out the worst of the rain. "It's not fancy," Frank said, stepping back to inspect his work, "but it'll keep you dry tonight." Sarah crawled out from beneath the wagon to examine the makeshift shelter. It was simple but effective, diverting the rainwater away from her resting place. For the first time in hours, she felt something close to comfort. "Thank you, Mr. Keller. That's very kind of you." Frank nodded, water still streaming from his hat. "Happy to help, Miss Grayson. Sarah Grayson. Pleased to meet you, Miss Grayson, though I wish the circumstances were better." He looked around at the muddy ground. "Got anything dry to sit on in there?" "Staying off the wet ground will make a world of difference." Sarah shook her head. "Everything I have is damp by now." Frank hesitated, then returned to his horse once more. He came back with a folded woolen blanket, surprisingly dry from being stored in an oiled saddlebag. "Take this," he said, offering it to her. "It's clean, I promise." Sarah accepted the blanket gratefully. "I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks, just looking out for a fellow traveler." He glanced up at the sky again. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon. I should be getting back." As he turned to leave, Sarah surprised herself by calling after him. "Mr. Keller," he paused, looking back. I have some coffee beans. If you could help me start a small fire under this shelter, perhaps you could warm up before continuing your journey." A smile broke across Frank's face, transforming his weathered features. "That's mighty hospitable of you, Miss Grayson. I'd be honored." Together, they gathered what dry kindling they could find, and Frank produced a tin of matches from an inside pocket of his coat. He carefully built a small fire just inside the shelter, positioning it so the smoke would draft away from where they sat. Soon, the comforting aroma of brewing coffee mingled with the petrichor scent of rain. As they sipped the hot, bitter liquid from Sarah's tin cups, she found herself sharing her story: her father's death, the creditors who had taken nearly everything, and her determination to reach the land he had purchased years ago. "It's near Nebraska City," she explained. "A small plot, but it's all I have left of him. I'm hoping to build a life there somehow." Frank listened attentively, occasionally adding wood to their small fire. "Nebraska City's about a day's ride from here, assuming the weather clears. It's good country around there, fertile soil for farming if that's what you're planning." "I haven't thought that far ahead," Sarah admitted. "I just knew I couldn't stay in Philadelphia. Sometimes that's enough of a plan to start with." Frank took another sip of coffee. "I came out here 5 years ago with not much more than a change of clothes and a stubborn streak wider than the Missouri River." "And now you have a ranch?" Sarah asked, curious despite herself. "A small one. Started as a hired hand, saved every penny, bought my own piece of land last year." Pride tinged his voice. "It's not much yet, but it's mine." They talked as the fire burned low, Frank sharing stories of his early days in Nebraska territory and the challenges and rewards of ranch life. Sarah found herself laughing at his tales of ornery cattle and mishaps with local wildlife, momentarily forgetting her own troubles. When the coffee was gone and the fire reduced to embers, Frank reluctantly rose to his feet. "I should let you get some rest, Miss Grayson. That shelter should hold through the night. Thank you again, Mr. Keller. I don't know what I would have done without your help." Frank adjusted his hat. "If you don't mind my saying so, traveling alone is risky business, especially for a lady. The trail to Nebraska City can be treacherous in places." "I haven't encountered any serious troubles yet," Sarah said, though the concern in his voice touched her. "Would you permit me to escort you the rest of the way? I've business in town tomorrow anyway, and it would ease my mind to see you safely to your destination." Sarah considered his offer. Over the hours they'd spent talking, she'd begun to trust this quiet, capable man whose kind eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Still, caution had been her companion for too long to abandon it completely. "That's very generous, but I wouldn't want to impose." No imposition at all, Frank assured her. I'll return at first light if that suits you. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded. I would appreciate the company, Mr. Keller. Until morning then, Miss Grayson. With a tip of his hat, Frank mounted his horse and disappeared into the rainy darkness. True to his word, Frank returned at dawn, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. The rain had finally stopped, though heavy clouds still hung low in the sky, threatening further downpours. Thought you might need some provisions, he explained, helping Sarah dismantle the shelter he'd built the night before. The trail gets sparse for a stretch before reaching Nebraska City. Sarah was touched by his thoughtfulness. Her own supplies had indeed dwindled to concerning levels, though she hadn't mentioned this during their conversation. They set off with Frank riding alongside Sarah's wagon, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local knowledge. Sarah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking the easy way he sat a horse, the strength in his hands as he guided the reins, the gentle respect with which he treated both animals and herself. By midday, they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek. As Sarah prepared a simple meal from the provisions Frank had brought, he examined her wagon's wheel, which had been making a worrying sound for the last few miles. Axles wearing thin, he commented, running a hand along the weathered wood. Might hold till Nebraska City, but I'd get it looked at straight away when we arrive. Is it safe to continue? Sarah asked, concern creasing her brow. Should be if we take it slow. Frank straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers. I know a good wheelwright in town who won't overcharge you just because you're from back east. As they ate, Sarah found herself contemplating what awaited her in Nebraska City. I haven't seen my father's land, she admitted. The deed describes it as 10 acres with a small cabin, but that could mean anything. Frank nodded thoughtfully. Land around Nebraska City varies. Some plots are prime farmland, others more suited to raising a few head of cattle. When was the deed issued? 1868. Father purchased it as an investment during a business trip west. He always talked about retiring there someday, but Sarah's voice trailed off. Well, 7 years isn't so long. Cabin might still be standing, especially if it was built solid. Frank offered her a reassuring smile. Whatever state it's in, we'll get you sorted. The casual "we" didn't escape Sarah's notice, but she found she didn't mind it. There was something comforting about not facing the unknown entirely alone. They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing as they approached the more settled areas surrounding Nebraska City. Fields appeared, then occasional farmhouses, and finally other travelers on the road. When they crested a hill and the town came into view, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. Nebraska City was larger than she'd expected, with proper streets lined with businesses and homes, the Missouri River gleaming in the distance. What do you think? Frank asked, noting her expression. It's more civilized than I imagined, Sarah replied honestly. Frank chuckled. Nebraska City's been established for quite some time. It's a proper town with all the amenities you'd need. Not like some settlements that are little more than a saloon and a general store. As they entered the outskirts of town, Sarah became acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after days on the trail. She attempted to smooth her hair and brush the worst of the dust from her traveling dress, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Frank guided them to a modest hotel on a side street, away from the busier saloons and establishments that catered primarily to men. Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable place here, he explained as he helped Sarah down from her wagon. She'll treat you fairly and keep the troublemakers away. I thought you might want to rest properly before we look into your father's property tomorrow. Sarah hesitated, mindful of her dwindling funds. "I'm not sure I can afford. Consider it part of the welcoming committee," Frank interrupted gently. "First night in Nebraska City should be comfortable at least." Before she could protest further, a plump woman with graying hair pinned in a neat bun emerged from the hotel's front door. "Frank Keller, haven't seen you in town for weeks," she called, her sharp eyes taking in Sarah and the loaded wagon. "And you've brought company, I see." "Mrs. Henderson, this is Miss Sarah Grayson," Frank introduced. "She's just arrived from Philadelphia to claim her father's property. I was hoping you might have a room available." Mrs. Henderson's face softened as she took in Sarah's travel-worn appearance. "Of course, dear. We've got a lovely room with a real feather bed," and she lowered her voice conspiratorially. "A bathtub I can have filled with hot water within the hour." The mention of a bath nearly brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "That sounds wonderful," she managed. While Mrs. Henderson led Sarah inside to settle her in, Frank arranged for Sarah's horse and wagon to be tended to at the livery stable. When he returned, he found Sarah in the hotel's small dining room, looking remarkably refreshed after having washed away the worst of the trail dust. "I'll call at the land office first thing tomorrow," he told her over a simple but hearty dinner of beef stew and fresh bread. "They'll have the records of your father's property and can direct us to the location." "You've already done so much," Sarah said. "Surely you have your own business to attend to," Frank shrugged, an easy smile playing at his lips. "Nothing that can't wait another day. Besides, I'd like to make sure that cabin is habitable before leaving you to your own devices." Sarah studied him across the table, trying to reconcile this kindness with the warnings she'd heard about the dangers of the West. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Keller? Truly?" Frank considered her question, taking a moment before answering. "I remember what it was like, arriving here with nothing but hope and determination. Someone helped me then, an old rancher who took a chance on a greenhorn from Chicago. I'm just passing along the favor." He paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps I don't like the idea of a lady like yourself facing all this alone." There was something in his steady gaze that made Sarah's cheeks warm. She looked down at her plate, suddenly conscious of the simple but clean dress she'd changed into, one of the few nice things she'd been able to bring with her. "Well, I am grateful for your assistance, Mr. Keller." "Frank," he corrected gently. "If we're to be neighbors of sorts, we might as well use our Christian names." "Frank," Sarah repeated, finding she liked the sound of it. "Then I insist you call me Sarah." They parted ways after dinner, Frank returning to the modest room he'd taken at the same hotel, promising to meet her for breakfast before they visited the land office. As Sarah settled into the clean sheets of the most comfortable bed she'd encountered in weeks, she found herself thinking about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to prayers. She hadn't even spoken aloud. Morning brought clear skies and renewed purpose. After breakfast, Frank escorted Sarah to the land office, where a balding clerk with spectacles perched on his nose examined the deed she presented. "Grayson. Grayson. Yes, here it is." The clerk ran a finger down a ledger. 10 acres, approximately 3 miles northwest of town. "There's a notation here about a cabin and well." He looked up at Sarah. "Your father purchased this site unseen, did he?" Sarah nodded. "It was an investment he never had the chance to visit." The clerk's expression turned sympathetic. "I see. Well, the property taxes are paid through the end of the year, so it's rightfully yours. I can have the deed transferred to your name today." While the clerk prepared the necessary documents, Frank studied a map on the wall, identifying the location of Sarah's property. "I know that area," he told her. "Good land, not too far from town but private enough. My ranch is about 5 miles further west." Once the paperwork was complete, They collected Sarah's wagon from the livery and set out toward her new home. The journey took just over an hour, with Frank leading the way along roads that gradually gave way to less traveled paths. When they finally turned onto a narrow track leading up a gentle slope, Sarah felt her heart racing. This was the culmination of months of planning and weeks of difficult travel. "There it is," Frank said quietly, pointing ahead to a small clearing where a cabin stood. Sarah's first impression was relief. The cabin existed and was still standing. Her second was concern at its obvious state of disrepair. The roof sagged in one corner, several window panes were missing, and the small porch listed to one side. Frank must have seen the worry on her face. "It's got good bones," he said encouragingly. "Nothing that can't be fixed with some work and materials." They approached slowly, Sarah taking in every detail of what was now her property. Beyond the cabin, she could see a meadow dotted with wildflowers, a small stand of trees, and what appeared to be the remains of a vegetable garden, now overgrown. "The well is around back," Frank noted, dismounting to help her down from the wagon. "Let's hope it's still good." The cabin door creaked in protest as Frank pushed it open. Inside was a single room with a stone fireplace, rough plank floors, and simple furnishings: a table with one chair, a bed frame without a mattress, and a few shelves built into the wall. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams, but there was no sign of major damage or wildlife having taken up residence. "Not so bad," Frank said, moving to inspect the fireplace. "Chimney looks clear, hearth is solid. Some new glass for the windows, repairs to the roof and porch, and this will be right comfortable." Sarah moved to the center of the room, turning slowly to take it all in. It was smaller than any place she'd ever lived, rustic in the extreme, and yet it was hers. A clean slate, a fresh start, a place where no one knew her as poor Sarah Grayson, whose father had lost everything. "I can stay here," she said, more to herself than to Frank. "I can make this work." Frank smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "That's the spirit." "But not tonight, I'm afraid. We'll need supplies and help to make this habitable." He was right, of course. The cabin needed cleaning, repairs, and basic furnishings before she could possibly stay there. And there was the matter of her future. What would she do with this land? How would she support herself? "I don't know the first thing about farming," Sarah confessed as they examined the overgrown garden plot. "Father was a merchant. I was raised to manage a household, not grow crops." "Farming's not the only option," Frank replied. "This much land could support a small orchard, maybe some chickens and a milk cow for your own needs. Nebraska cities growing there might be opportunity for a woman with household management skills." They spent the rest of the day taking inventory of what needed to be done, with Frank making notes on repairs and materials required. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they reluctantly packed up to return to town. "I can introduce you to people who can help," Frank told her as they drove back. "Abe Miller's a fair carpenter, and the Wilsons' oldest boy is looking for odd jobs. For a reasonable wage, they could have this place fixed up within a couple of weeks." Sarah was quiet, calculating costs in her head. Her remaining funds would cover basic repairs and simple furnishings, but little more. She would need to find work quickly. Sensing her concerns, Frank added, "Mrs. Henderson mentioned she's been looking for help at the hotel. And I know the mercantile owner's wife is expecting their third child soon. She might welcome an educated woman to help with the books." As they reached town, the warm glow of lanterns from windows gave Nebraska City a welcoming feel, despite Sarah's uncertainty. Frank escorted her back to the hotel, promising to introduce her to the carpenter the following day. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about her cabin, and the daunting tasks ahead. Yet mixed with her anxiety was a strange excitement. For the first time in her life, her path was entirely her own to choose. And though she had arrived as a stranger, she already had at least one person willing to help her find her way. True to his word, Frank spent the next several days introducing Sarah to key people in Nebraska City. Abe Miller, the carpenter, agreed to begin repairs on the cabin immediately. Mrs. Wilson, the merchant's wife, was indeed looking for assistance with bookkeeping and offered Sarah part-time work that would allow her flexibility to oversee the repairs to her property. Within a week, Sarah had established a routine. Mornings were spent at the mercantile, afternoons at her cabin overseeing the work, and evenings back in town planning for the next day. Frank came by regularly, sometimes bringing supplies or offering advice, other times simply providing company as the cabin slowly transformed into a home. "You're making remarkable progress," he commented one afternoon as they stood surveying the newly repaired roof and porch. Inside, the floors had been scrubbed, the windows reglazed, and a new mattress placed on the bed frame. "Thanks to your help," Sarah replied. She had noticed that Frank often scheduled his trips to town to coincide with her visits to the cabin, and she had come to look forward to his company. "I've been thinking," Frank said, hesitation in his voice, "about your garden plot. It's late to plant much this season, but if you're interested, I could help you prepare it for next spring. Maybe put in a few quick-growing vegetables now so you'll have something of your own harvest this fall." Sarah smiled, touched by his continued thoughtfulness. "I'd like that, though I'm afraid I'd need quite a lot of instruction. Happy to provide it." Frank's eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary before he looked away, clearing his throat. "Actually, there's something else I wanted to mention. My neighbor's cow just had a calf she can't feed, twin births, and the mother's rejecting the second one. If you're interested, I could bring it over. Bottle feeding's a chore, but by winter it would give you a start on your own small herd." The offer was practical yet personal, a way for her to begin building something sustainable. "That's very generous. Are you sure your neighbor would part with it for the right price, which isn't much considering the alternative?" Frank's expression grew more serious. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I admire what you're doing here. Not many women or men, for that matter, would have the courage to start over like this, especially alone." His words warmed her. Over the weeks, since their chance meeting in the rainstorm, Sarah had come to value Frank's opinion more than she would have thought possible of someone she'd known for such a short time. "Sometimes courage is simply having no alternative," she replied. "But I'm finding I enjoy the challenge more than I expected." She hesitated, then added, "And I'm not entirely alone." The smile that spread across Frank's face made her heart beat a little faster. As June turned to July, the cabin became truly habitable. Sarah moved in permanently, though she continued her work at the mercantile, riding into town on a gentle mare Frank had helped her select to replace the draft horse that had pulled her wagon. Life developed a pleasant rhythm. During the week, Sarah divided her time between town and her growing homestead, where she now had a small vegetable garden, the beginning of a flower bed around the porch, and a cow pen that housed not only the orphaned calf Frank had brought, but also a milk cow he had helped her purchase. Sundays became special days. After church in town, Frank would often accompany Sarah back to her cabin for dinner, sometimes bringing small gift seeds for her garden, a book he thought she might enjoy, or once, a kitten from a litter born in his barn to help keep mice at bay. These visits stretched longer as summer progressed, with Frank finding reasons to stay until the evening light faded. helping with small projects or simply sitting on the porch talking as twilight settled over the prairie. Sarah found herself looking forward to these times more than anything else in her new life. One such Sunday in late July, as they sat watching fireflies begin to dance over the meadow, Frank turned to her with unusual seriousness. "Sarah, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart skipped a beat at his tone. In the golden light of sunset, his features seemed both familiar and somehow new, as though she was seeing beneath the surface to the man inside. "Yes," she prompted when he didn't immediately continue. Frank shifted on the porch step where they sat side by side. "I've enjoyed our time together these past weeks, more than enjoyed it if I'm being honest." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I know you came here to be independent, to build something that's entirely your own, and I respect that more than I can say." Sarah remained quiet, sensing there was more he needed to express. "The thing is," Frank continued, his voice growing more confident, "I find myself thinking about you when we're apart, wondering how your day is going, if you're managing all right, if there's anything you need." He smiled slightly. "And I reckon that's not just neighborly concern anymore." A warm feeling spread through Sarah's chest. She had been aware of her own growing feelings for some time but had hesitated to acknowledge them, even to herself. "Frank, you don't need to say anything right now," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm not asking for promises, just permission, I suppose." "Permission," Sarah echoed, "to court you properly, to see if what I'm feeling might be something you could share." The simple honesty of his request touched her deeply. In Philadelphia, courtship had been a formal affair of calling cards and chaperone visits. Here in Nebraska, it seemed to be as straightforward and unvarnished as everything else. "I think," Sarah said carefully, meeting his eyes, "that I would like that very much." The smile that broke across Frank's face was like sunrise. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned closer and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. As summer gave way to autumn, Frank's courtship proceeded with the same straightforward sincerity that marked everything he did. There were no grand gestures, just consistent, thoughtful actions that showed his growing affection. He took her on picnics along the river, introduced her to friends who quickly became her own, and taught her the practical skills she needed to thrive on her land. Together, they harvested her small garden, preserved the vegetables for winter, and prepared the soil for next year's planting. Sarah found herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone before. She told him about her mother's death when she was 14, the years spent managing her father's household, and eventually, the truth about her father's financial ruin, not merely business setbacks as she'd initially implied, but gambling debts that had nearly left her destitute. Frank listened without judgment, sharing his own story in return: his father's death in a Chicago factory accident, his mother's struggle to raise 3 children alone, and his eventual decision to head west in search of a different kind of life. "I wrote to her every month until she passed 2 years ago," he told Sarah one crisp October evening as they walked along the edge of her property. "Sent most of my earnings, too, to help with my younger sisters. They're both married now, with families of their own in Illinois." "You must miss them," Sarah said, understanding the ache of family separated by distance. "I do. But I've built something here that I'm proud of." Frank looked out over the rolling landscape, golden in the autumn light. "It's not the biggest spread, but it's good land with plenty of room to grow." There was something in his voice that hinted at future hopes, dreams that might include more than just cattle and horses. Sarah felt her cheeks warm at the direction of her thoughts. Their first kiss came on Thanksgiving Day. Sarah had invited Frank for dinner, along with the Millers and Hendersons, wanting to establish her own traditions in her new home. The day had been filled with good food, laughter, and the warm comfort of friendships that were beginning to feel like family. After the guests had departed, Frank stayed to help with the last of the cleaning up. They worked companionably side by side, and when the final dish was dried and put away, he turned to her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Not a proper Thanksgiving gift, just something I saw and thought you might like." He held out a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Sarah unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver hairpin with a small pearl set into the end. "Frank, it's beautiful," she breathed, running a finger over the polished surface. "Reminded me of you," he said simply. "Beautiful but practical." Sarah looked up at him, feeling a surge of emotion too complex to name. Without thinking, she stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle question, but when Frank's arms came around her waist, drawing her closer, it deepened into something that sent warmth coursing through her entire body. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Sarah Grayson," Frank whispered, his forehead resting against hers. "I think I've already fallen," she confessed, the words easier to say than she had expected. Winter brought snow and bitter cold, but Sarah's cabin remained warm and snug thanks to the careful preparations she and Frank had made. The repairs had held, the root cellar was stocked with preserves and vegetables, and a shed attached to the back of the cabin housed the milk cow and calf, now a growing heifer. Frank visited whenever the weather allowed, sometimes staying to help with chores or share a meal, other times simply to sit by the fire and talk. Their courtship progressed naturally, each day deepening the connection between them. By Christmas, Sarah had fully embraced her new life. Her work at the mercantile had expanded to include managing special orders and correspondence, providing her with a steady income to supplement what she earned from selling milk and eggs in town. The holiday itself was celebrated with a gathering at her cabin, which now bore the unmistakable touches of a home curtains at the windows, a braided rug on the floor, and shelves filled with books and small treasures. As their friends departed after the festivities, Frank lingered, helping Sarah bank the fire for the night. When the last ember was safely contained, he turned to her with unusual nervousness. "I have another gift for you," he said. "One I didn't want to give you in front of everyone." Sarah smiled, curious. "And what might that be?" Instead of answering immediately, Frank took both her hands in his expression serious yet tender. "Sarah, these past months have been the happiest of my life. When I found you that night in the rain, I never imagined how completely you would change my world." Sarah's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. Frank continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I know we haven't known each other terribly long by some standards, but out here, people recognize what matters when they find it. And you, Sarah Grayson, matter to me more than anything." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife." Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense it felt almost like pain. "Yes," she said simply, then again with more force. "Yes, Frank, I will." His smile was brilliant as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "Not fancy, but given with all the love in my heart." "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, looking down at the ring before raising her eyes to his. "You're perfect." Their kiss sealed the promise between them, a pledge of partnership and love that would face whatever challenges the frontier might bring. They were married on a bright January morning in 1876, in the small church in Nebraska City, with their friends gathered to witness. Sarah wore a new blue dress, with Frank's pearl hairpin securing her veil, and Frank looked handsome in a crisp white shirt and his best jacket. The decision about where to live had been reached after much discussion. They would make their home at Frank's ranch, which offered more space and established infrastructure for their future together, but would maintain Sarah's cabin and land as well. "We'll plant that orchard you talked about," Frank had suggested. "Apple trees take years to mature, but they'll be there for our children and grandchildren." The mention of children had brought a blush to Sarah's cheeks, but also a sense of rightness. This was what she wanted, not just survival, but a full life with the man she loved. Their first night as husband and wife was spent at Sarah's cabin, which Frank insisted was fitting given it was where their love had truly begun to grow. The next morning, they packed her most essential belongings into the wagon and made the journey to what would now be their home together. Frank's ranch was indeed modest by some standards, a sturdy two-room cabin expanded with a lean-to kitchen, a barn, corral, and several outbuildings, all situated on 100 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it. But to Sarah, it represented far more than its physical dimensions. It was the embodiment of Frank's years of hard work and determination, just as her own small property represented hers. Spring brought new beginnings in more ways than one. As they planted the promised apple trees on Sarah's land, now officially part of the Keller ranch, she shared the news she had suspected for several weeks. They were expecting a child in late autumn. Frank's joy was boundless. He lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, mindful of her condition even in his excitement. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the prairie in gold and crimson, his hand rested protectively over hers on her still flat stomach. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed quietly. "When I left Chicago, all I wanted was land of my own and the freedom to work it as I saw fit. I never imagined I'd find someone to share it with, someone who understands what it means." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, content in a way she hadn't known was possible. "When I left Philadelphia, I was running away from the past. I never dreamed I'd be running toward something so much better." Their son, James, was born on a cold November night with the assistance of Mrs. Henderson and the local midwife. He had Frank's eyes and chin and Sarah's chestnut hair. Both parents were immediately smitten. As winter settled over the prairie once more, the small family established new rhythms and routines. Sarah discovered that motherhood, while challenging, brought rewards she hadn't anticipated, not just in the joy of watching her son grow and develop, but in the way it deepened her bond with Frank, seeing him as a tender, devoted father. By the following spring, they had expanded their operations to include additional cattle and horses. Sarah's experience with bookkeeping proved valuable as they managed their growing enterprise, while Frank's knowledge of ranching and the local markets helped them make sound decisions for their future. They worked as true partners, each contributing their strengths and supporting the other's weaknesses. When drought threatened their second summer, they faced it together, making difficult choices and sacrificing where necessary to ensure their animals and land survived. The years passed with the natural rhythm of frontier life, seasons of plenty and scarcity, joy and hardship, all weathered together. Their family grew with the addition of a daughter, Emma, 2 years after James, and another son, William, 3 years later. The apple trees on Sarah's original property began to bear fruit, and each autumn became a family tradition of harvest and preserving. The cabin itself was maintained as a special retreat, occasionally used when they needed space from the busier ranch, or as a guest house when Frank's sisters finally made the journey west to visit. On the 5th anniversary of the night Frank had built a shelter over Sarah's wagon, he surprised her with a gift, a small painting he had commissioned from an artist passing through Nebraska City, depicting their first meeting in the rain. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it captured the essence of that pivotal moment, the stranger's kindness that had changed the course of two lives. "You ever wonder," Sarah asked as they looked at the painting together, "what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by that night? If you had taken another route home, or if the storm hadn't been so severe?" Frank considered the question seriously, his arm warm around her shoulders. "I've thought about it. Might be that you would have made it to town on your own, set up on your land, built a different life. Or caught pneumonia under that wagon," Sarah added with a small smile. "The way I see it," Frank said, turning to face her fully, "some things are meant to be, regardless of the path. I believe I was supposed to find you that night, just as you were supposed to come west." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch still sending a shiver through her after all their years together. "Maybe in a different life, I'd have met you in town, or at church, or somewhere else entirely, but I'd have known you were the one for me just the same." Sarah thought of all that had grown from that chance encounter: their marriage, their children, the thriving ranch that now employed several hands and was known throughout the region for quality stock. She thought of the friends they'd made, the community they'd helped build, and the countless moments, both ordinary and extraordinary, that had filled their years together. "I think you're right," she said softly. "Some things are simply meant to be." As they stood together in the home they had built, their children's laughter drifting in from outside where they played under the watchful eye of Frank's younger sister, who was visiting from Illinois, Sarah felt a profound gratitude for the storm that had once seemed like such misfortune. From beneath a wagon in the rain to the shelter of love that would last a lifetime, it wasn't the life she had expected, but it was one more beautiful than she could have imagined. And it had all begun with a simple act of kindness: a cowboy building a roof for a stranger on a stormy night. By 1890, the Keller Ranch had grown into one of the most respected in the region. James, now 14, was showing every sign of following in his father's footsteps, with a natural affinity for working with horses and a head for business that pleased his mother. Emma, at 12, was already managing the household accounts with Sarah's guidance, while 9-year-old William had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and could often be found helping with repairs around the property. Sarah and Frank had weathered the highs and lows that came with frontier life: years of good harvests and profitable cattle sales, as well as periods of drought, harsh winters, and economic downturns. Through it all, their partnership had remained unshakable, their love deepening with each challenge overcome together. On their 15th wedding anniversary, as they walked hand in hand through the now mature apple orchard on Sarah's original property, Frank reflected on their journey. "Remember when I said these trees would be for our children and grandchildren? I didn't realize how quickly that time would come." Sarah smiled, thinking of James's increasing interest in a certain neighbor's daughter, though both were still young. "It won't be grandchildren for a while yet, I hope." "No rush," Frank agreed, pulling her close. "But it's good to know we've built something that will outlast us, something our family can build upon for generations." As the sun set over the Nebraska plains, casting long shadows through the orchard, Sarah thought about the frightened, desperate young woman she had been, huddled beneath a wagon in the rain. How little she had understood then about the life awaiting her, the love she would find, and the strength she possessed. "Thank you," she said suddenly, looking up at the man who had been her partner through it all. "For what?" Frank asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had always loved. "For building me a roof that night, for seeing something in me worth helping, for loving me through everything that came after." Frank's expression softened with understanding. "Best thing I ever did," he said simply, "stopping in that storm." He leaned down to kiss her, the gesture as tender now as it had been when they were younger. "Here's to many more years, Mrs. Keller, many more years indeed." And as they made their way back to the ranch where their children awaited, where lights glowed warm in windows and the sounds of their life together filled the evening air, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just shelter, but a true home in this place, in this life, and most of all, in the love of the man who had once built her a roof in the rain.